All right. Welcome everyone to the COVID crew. My name is Angelina Rivera. Can we all introduce ourselves and get ready?
My name is Shruti Singh.
I'm Colin Shepard.
I'm Gavin Trossel.
All right, awesome. Today we're going to be talking about COVID-19, international relations, and the relations between great powers and how COVID-19 has impacted their relations. So we're going to get into the background of the pandemic. We've all had a really long year and year and a half, 7 months. So we all pretty much know what COVID is like, but for those who don't know, it originated in Wuhan, China in December of 2019, hence the 19 in its name. By January 2020, the first cases in US and Europe were confirmed, marking the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And as a result, a bunch of nations started moving as quick as they could to develop a vaccine in time. We had ones like US Operation Warp Speed, Russian Sputnik, and as soon as we began industrializing COVID vaccine production, we also began to see nations locking down their borders. You guys want to real quick talk about experiences with the lockdown, how it's felt?
It's been tough.
It's been terrible.
Yeah, I was scared because I have an immunocompromised thing. So it's like,
I could say we're all pretty passionate about getting COVID to end as soon as possible. And then this year and a half has taken a toll on all of us. But luckily, vaccines have developed and have been rolling out as of late 2020 and mid 2021. It seems like the situation's finally stabilizing at least a little bit, with about 4.5 million people worldwide, unfortunately, succumbing to COVID, but a lot of people are getting vaccinated now. So are all of us vaccinated here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Oh.
I actually got COVID in between my first and second shot, so that was
Aw.
really fun.
That's awful. I'm
that's
sorry.
awful.
Well, luckily you got the second shot and everything seems all good.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Awesome. Then issues that we're facing is that many nations are facing whether or not to cooperate with one another and solve the issue, or to adopt a policy of self-help, working in relative isolation from one another to solve the pandemic and develop the vaccines. The question is, should countries give vaccines to less developed countries? How much effort should be put in? Should the development of vaccines should have it been more cooperative? And then how can countries use the pandemic to increase their sphere of influence and their power in the global system?
Yeah. So what we're really trying to do here is look at how liberal institutionalism compares to realism in the context of COVID-19. Specifically, we're be looking at a couple of things, but it's going to be like along the lines of the inconsistencies of the vaccine delivery worldwide and how the race to create the first vaccines reflected a drive for international power and influence. We're also going to look at how travel restrictions resulting from the pandemic has impacted the ideas around liberal institutionalism. And then we're going to finally take a look at India as a case study to contextualize our findings and our conclusion. In the light of these aspects that we explore, is our attention to explain why offensive realism offers maybe not a complete, but definitely the most appropriate explanation of how COVID-19 has impacted international relations.
Right, awesome. With that frame of reference to get right into it, Gavin, you want to talk about offensive realism for us?
Yeah, gladly. So talking about offensive realism, it makes a few assumptions just generally about states. First, it works on the state as the primary unit of analysis. So everything is focused on the state. And in realism, more broadly, it's major powers or states that hold a lot of power that are the important states to look at, because those are the ones that are greatly affecting the international system. And now the biggest assumption, of course, that is made in offensive realism or realism is that the international system is anarchic. And this is really important because it's the driving principle in what is called self-help, which is that in an anarchic system, there is really nobody else who is going to help you but yourself. You can't rely on others because there is no governing body. There's no police officers like we have in local society who are going to enforce rules or contracts or obligations between states. And so a state has to rely on itself because it really can't trust anybody else. More specifically, in offensive realism, it assumes that because states can't trust each other, and because a state's main goal in an international system is its own survival, it holds that states will work to expand their own power to become regional hegemonies, or more simply to dominate a region. And so they'll do that through military means or other means that will raise their own power. And looking more specifically at COVID, because of course this is a theory that really talks about raising military power to dominate systems. But COVID really, in the vaccines, have kind of created this power dynamic that is quite similar to military means. Not to mention that COVID-19 itself is a pretty great risk to a nation's security and in that sense, its own survival. As we'll get into more specifically, vaccines really can represent power. And not only that, but how nations respond to that power and how they respond to each other in terms of their own security, keeping their own security up in light of COVID-19 is really reflective of offensive realism or just realism in general.
All right, awesome. That covers offensive realism very well. Thank you so much for that explanation. We are going to be comparing that to liberal institutionalism, which is similar in the sense that the international system is anarchic, excuse me. I don't know why I was about to say anarchic. That would have been terrible. But additionally, states are also the primary unit of measurement. But instead of states relying solely on themselves because no one can help, states are expected to form alliances and treaties with each other to minimize conflict and to cooperate alongside each other. This is, of course, tested more with the more and more states added, the more complications there are. And there are a set of sort of theories that we like to call game theory that help us categorize each situation and helps us tackle it accordingly. You might have heard of the prisoner's dilemma, stag hunt, chicken, battle of the sexes, etc. Those are all sort of lenses that we use in liberal institutionalism to view problems and to either collaborate, coordinate, and solve any quarrels that might lead to instability or lead to civil unrest. We see a lot of solutions in liberal institutionalism coming to creating a regime or an institution like the United Nations or the European Union, which we see a lot in our discussion with COVID. Those two are very big factors in how the pandemic was handled and how we will continue to handle the pandemic in the future. The ultimate goal of liberal institutionalism too is to integrate communities for maximum security and economic success as liberal institutionalism heads into neoliberalism, excuse me. We'll talk about that later. But while offensive realism suggests that vaccines represent power and nations should give vaccines to other nations only if it increases power, liberal institutionalism wants states to work together to give all nations vaccines and ultimately stop the spread. So similar to how we'd want to avoid war, we would want to avoid the end of human times by eliminating the pandemic as a possibility. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, thank you, Angelina, for the explanation. But I do want to go back to what Gavin said about when he was introducing offensive realism about how vaccines represent power. Because as we looked at the development of vaccines, we really do see it as a quest for more power and influence in the international system, if we look at it through a realist lens. I think overall, the way that nations viewed vaccine development was that there was haves and have-nots. And definitely developed nations like the United States, Russia, and China wanted to be ones with stockpiles and of vaccines and the ability to make vaccines for their own people. And what we see is that kind of the example of imitation that realism mentions, as when the United States announced Operation Warp Speed, we see other nations like Russia and China quickly follow with, projects like Sputnik 5 for Russia and the Sinopharm BIP project, which was not in a collaborative kind of working together, but definitely a competition between these powers to be the first to create a vaccine. And the reason for this, I believe, is that, states with vaccines can, satisfy this idea of self-help, protect their own citizens and guaranteeing their own safety and stability, which furthermore, they can then leverage surplus vaccines as like bargaining chips against nations who do not have the ability to make their own vaccines. In a way, it can be comparable to like an arms race, but with vaccines, where we have these states building up their stockpiles of medical supplies and vaccines, even in amounts that are totally unnecessary, purely out of fear of future shortages and a mistrust between nations on whether they'll be actually able to protect their citizens or not.
Yeah, makes totally sense, Colin. I also want to come back to Angelina's point about how liberal institutions could help COVID vaccines, especially talking about the EU and the UN. So at first, because of how the EU operated in terms of protecting themselves and having that stability, many of the EU members decided that it wasn't a need for rush for developing vaccines simply because they were already quote unquote safe and they didn't need it. Unfortunately, that created a lack of vaccines and lack of operation needed. And then there was an increase of deaths of vaccines. So then they started a negotiation. According to the Brookings, EU never had a prior experience with health matters, which is something to develop later, and how like liberalism doesn't have experience in terms of health related matters as well as economic matters, because they are mainly as a way of preventing war instead of like economics. So this is like a very COVID-19 has been like very much in their own interest. And you can see that the EU has been taken a lot of the more of the offensive theory of how the European nations commissions they made an alliance between France, Germany, and Netherlands of how they wanted to join and make developing their own vaccines and create that. But however, many of the undeveloped countries would not receive it simply because of the lack of money. And even though the EU promised it, it wasn't given to them at the current time they needed it.
All of that's pretty damning evidence against the EU, and how even more so against liberal institutionalism, as we can see that the EU failed to help many countries receive the vaccine in time.
They're definitely like the EU is doing the Ole method, in which like they're creating the low members of the game so that they can work together and they don't have that much discourse within themselves, and so that they can power against and have that economic prosperity and economic power over the underdeveloped natures and have that control in the EU. And then we also see that the UN tried to implement, again, tried is a very highlighted word in this area, in which they haven't really done that many actions. They wanted to donate 8 billion funds, according to Forbes, to members of the foundation. However, this is going for the entire almost countries, which isn't enough for especially underdeveloped countries. However, it is more than enough for developed countries that have the vaccine and have the program. So we see that the UN obviously prefer the developed nations and the hegemon over the underdeveloped nations.
Right. We can also see that in a push for very particular vaccines. Did you guys know just how many vaccines have been developed and approved? We have Pfizer, Moderna, obviously, as well as the Johnson & Johnson, but all over the world, we have the Oxford AstraZeneca, we have CanSino, which is in China, Sinopharm, Sinovac, Sinopharm from Wuhan specifically, Bharat Biotech, I believe that's how it's pronounced. Bharat, excuse me.
Yeah, you're fine.
Awesome, thank you so much. There are so many vaccines, but specifically we find that the EU and the UN prefer those vaccines specifically from like the US.
And the caveat is also that the underdeveloped nations can't even go to other suppliers to get it from. They have to use the EU, what the EU gave them, simply because under the contract of, or like the alliances that they built with them. And so it creates this like liberal institution. It's failing for underdeveloped countries. However, it is prospering for countries that are developed in the Western countries specifically. Yeah. And so we see those two dilemmas.
Ones who are playing the game of offensive realism.
Yeah. I hate to jump on the bandwagon against liberal institutionalism, but I really do think we see inconsistent messaging from developed nations, because we see on one hand a very liberal institutionalism-esque talk from a lot of developed countries where they will pledge billions of vaccines, all these agreements and treaties with more underdeveloped nations. Like I see an example is Nigeria, where they're waiting still on over 30 million vaccines. Not that were promised as a donation, but they paid for, and they still haven't received them. On one hand, as much as I want to believe in these, in the UN and WHO and these developed nations to follow through on the cooperation promised by liberal institutionalism, the walk is not matching the talk at all. And to be honest, and it's true. But we even look now at the UN recently, in the past month, African states were calling out developed nations for what they call, quote, vaccine apartheid, as you see the wealthy nations giving out, third booster shots to their citizens. Meanwhile, people living in these less developed nations have not even gotten a single shot at all. So I do think there's a very large dichotomy between what is being said and what is being done in practice.
And Colin, to your point, it's not even just that there aren't enough vaccines to go around. These vaccines exist. There is a surplus of vaccines at this point. Production has been ramped up to a point where wealthier nations can absolutely spare vaccines, but they're not. And I think to a point that is reflective of the self-help model, right? That I think you talked about. It's just that, you know, there could be efforts put into trying to give these vaccines to more nations, but it's just not happening because it really, at the end of the day, isn't in a nation's own interest, not important to its own survival for it to keep going with that, to follow through on its word in supplying these African countries.
Yeah, I will qualify. I will defend liberal institutionalism quickly. Even in some examples, we do still see countries going out of their way to help others. I mean, we see America, yes, they pledged over 1 billion vaccines. That has not happened, but they still have donated 171 million vaccines when objectively they didn't have to. Now, is this out of the goodness of our hearts, or is it because of wanting political influence? That's up for debate. But I do think that states are doing something. I know we're going to talk about India more in a minute, but I do see when India was desperate for oxygen supplies in the height of the second wave last year, we did see countries like the United States help. Now, was it to the degree that would really solve the issue? No, but it was more than nothing. So I do think that there is still some cooperation happening, albeit it's just not at the level that would be beneficial for everyone involved.
Yeah, I agree to a certain extent with Colin. However, we can also I would like to highlight how it's like more than nothing, in which that there's coming back to the point where it's an anarchy system and that there is no guarantee of anything. Like you don't have any guarantee of they will give you this, and it's all known as donations. We see how if you look at the US donations, it's also important to highlight which countries they're giving it to. Mm-hmm. And which countries, are they giving it to Western countries that already have the means to afford it, or are they giving it to underdeveloped countries that don't have the means to afford it, nor can they make it? And then in terms of India, India has been the number one supplier in terms of medicine, in terms of trade, and especially in terms of vaccines. So is the US giving a small portion simply because I need the same trade and I need that alliance for my own state? And is it donating to the fact that it's in the good of the name, or is it because they want to increase their security and they want to increase their power? And so that is something, especially with COVID, with vaccines, of how they're delivering it and which countries are getting it, and how much of each country is getting it is, I believe, is purely on the basis of having that power and having that depthness with each country.
Who is giving and who is taking, and how much are they giving and how much are they taking? We'll get into how the US and India have interacted with each other and helped each other throughout the pandemic later. But if we've talked so much about the vaccines, international trade, international relations, let's talk about border control.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we talk about travel restrictions, border lockdowns, it's important to first preface this with that this was done for the purposes of health safety around the world. And so I think that that's just an important note to go into it with. But with that in mind, I think these restrictions are really reflective of a debate between liberal institutionalism and offensive realism to an extent. And I think one place where you can look at that is the Schengen area in the European Union. And for those who aren't familiar, this is essentially a region in the European Union that permits free travel of people and goods under the EU customs and economic market. So essentially, by being a citizen of a European nation who's in the EU, you are then a citizen of the EU and are permitted free travel. But with COVID, an interesting event occurred in which the countries that were involved in the Schengen area, began locking down their own borders. And I think this is reflective to an extent of a breaking down of cooperation within the EU, because with this saw an increase in tension between EU countries. the splitting apart of family members occurred. European citizens who either had to commute for work or wanted to take a job in another country could no longer do so. And so it kind of created a lot of problems between European nations in trying to work out how people should be traveling between these nations. And I think that's reflective of kind of a more inward focus being taken in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, one that mirrors that self-help model that is so evident in realist theory. Alongside that, and in fact, taking inspiration from the Shenzhen area, on January 25th, in fact, I believe this would be, correct me if I'm wrong, 5 days after his inauguration, President Joe Biden passed an executive order that would essentially oversee the ending of immigration into the United States, tentatively because of COVID-19. And I think that this is pretty significant because it's, of course, while you can argue for the purposes of health reasons, kind of a politicization of COVID-19 that's also being used to kind of take a more inward policy approach, one that is spurning cooperation between nations, not allowing immigrants in, but also not allowing visitors from other countries in. And that kind of takes us into another issue, which is that more recently, this would have been in August of this year, the European Union finally started opening up borders, specifically with the United States. And the expectation was that the United States would mirror that and open their borders up in kind. But that didn't happen. What was supposed to be sort of a statement of the world emerging from the pandemic, that didn't happen. And in that sense, I think we can see the United States choosing security over cooperation, its own security over international cooperation. It's so much easier for a nation to uphold its own security by keeping borders closed than by investing into vaccine checks. Because one, of course, not everybody wants to get vaccinated. And two, just checking for vaccination status can be difficult, especially with the rise of people faking vaccines. People may not have their cards on them. And so it just creates these issues that make it quite difficult to do so.
I think it's interesting that of all countries, the EU would want to open up travel again with the United States, considering how much of a problem we have with getting our own citizens to commit to vaccination. And like you said, committing to actually getting the vaccination instead of faking vaccine cards or vaccination status.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I think of course, we talked about the US and Europe, but a lot of these concepts I think that we've talked about are kind of abstract and maybe could be applied to a particular case study. Shruti, I know you had something you wanted to talk about regarding India, which we've hinted at a few times. Do you want to take it away?
Yeah, definitely on for India. So basically as a background information, once COVID hit worldwide, India was one of the top leading in terms of COVID safeties. Now, this is really hard because, again, it's 4.1 billion people that they have to control. Yet, they preeminently did better than the US, which is a developing, like a first world nation versus a third world nation, if you compare it upon it, simply because they had lower cases. A lot of if you look at the liberal institution on that area, the government did particularly took in hone of like making sure that the planes, every single thing was clean, there was masks developed, no one was allowed on the street by a certain time, there was policemen, as much as we can discuss on like how police force and brutality, but that's like a later thing. So it became this idea that they would not need vaccines at this moment, simply because our vaccine control is doing amazing. So everyone thought like, oh, they were immune to COVID essentially. However, and so they became the suppliers, the main unit of suppliers. They were one of the world's largest makers of vaccine according to World of India Today. And now, as you can see, they have gone through one of the worst pandemics ever. And if you look at the amount of vaccines that they supplied, because we were talking about how like distribution is particularly there, they did it to mainly African countries and to their neighboring countries. Another reason why I believe that those of the supplying things is that because China and India are currently not are at a warring state with each other. And they knew that China had a lot of hold on African countries. So therefore, if they provided vaccines to African countries, their security against China would be more developed because of same economic reasons of like security. And so they gave it to Algeria, Egypt, Oman, Morocco. They gave it to around 95 countries of vaccine. They still gave it to UN nations. They still gave it to Europe. They gave it to Germany. They gave it to some to the US in terms of like the supplies and the materials. So they had a lot of in terms of that. However, we can see that at February 24, 2021, only 13,816 cases, according to the Lancet. And yet, when we started getting vaccines, they hit around 389,682 cases daily. Like that was like the daily average. And so we can see this, like the daily average. That's terrible. It's so bad. And you can see that it's a contradiction. What I like want to highlight is that where there wasn't any vaccines, it was at one of the lowest cases. But when there started to the vaccine developments, it was one of the highest cases. Unfortunately, we look at it, a lot of the members, a lot of the citizens of India were saying to Modi, particularly of how you are helping other countries, but you're not helping the country within. Like everyone thought like, oh, since we're vaccine free, we're COVID free and everything will like go out. And so there was like an increase of cases. And there wasn't after that, they expected now 4.1 billion vaccines within their own selves. So they had to come back and like stop giving vaccines to all these countries, which is another discussion to talk about with Africa, especially because they just got their first shot. Now they need their second shot in Africa, but they can't do it because India is going through a global pandemic. And you see that like Africa now as a whole continent needs help. But the EU, the UN, and all these like developed nations aren't really helping as much as supplies to Africa, nor are they to India, because they gave it to only 11 countries. India, France giving some medical oxygen tanks, France, Germany, Pakistan, which is ironically one of the most rival countries, they still gave support. India, Saudi Arabia, on India Times, there's like a whole list of countries that gave support. And US was one of the bottom 3 countries, like the lowest donations, which is the irony is that because the US and India have an alliance in terms of medical supplies as well as vaccine supplies as well. Biden kept saying we'll support India, we'll give them this, we'll do this. There's a lot of, I guess what Colin was saying, there's a lot of talk and there's no doing. Yeah. And essentially India was going in their own rabbit hole of like needing supplies, needing tanks. But the only thing that they could help is themselves. So they had to come back within their own supplies and work on their own. And the US was not happy about this at all. And so they were discussing this over the UN, and they were discussing that they want to recently drop the export ban of vaccination so that the rates could reduce for themselves and for the developing nations. So it's like these countries that can afford their own vaccine, yet for some reason is asking an underdeveloped country that is going through a pandemic to make supplies for themselves. So it's like, again, the security balance of like, no one is really like supporting other countries and there's no cooperation. There's only cooperations so that one country and that the security of one country could be beneficial over the others.
So basically India was living in a liberal mindset while the rest of the world was living in a realist mindset, pretending to be liberal. Yeah.
And then now you currently see that India is going back to the realism mindset in which they are right now, simply only giving few exports to nations in order to what they feel is to help security levels. And currently right now, even countries like well-vaccinated countries are still saying like, hey, we're gonna like for the African and other developing countries, we're gonna like help them kind of like just like with their lockdown, but they should open up their lockdown borders. They should open up, even though those countries physically cannot support opening up their countries. They need to work on their own country. So we can see that liberalism truly failed in terms of India simply because the hegemonies of especially the Western countries that have the most power and have the most money use their liberalism ideas for themselves and use it for their own security.
There are just too many non-cooperative states for us to possibly work.
Yeah. I believe that like we should build better liberal institutions as well as and work on having those institutions, especially if COVID-19, obviously, I think anyone can come upon this saying like it's been truly a shocker for all these countries to like work together. And it showed how we cannot like it's almost like they couldn't be able to work together simply because they wanted their own like security. They wanted their own economic advances in terms of the vaccine. It was like another race for vaccines.
Yeah, we've seen time and time again races, like seeing the race for the vaccine reminded me of space race. When it comes to science, our hope is the liberal institutionalism, but our reality is more often than not offensive realism.
Yeah. And I think that like the US and other like the EU, the US, and other countries were trying to weaponize the COVID-19 as a way to gain monetary power and as well as like economic power. And then the India was trying to also do the similar rants in which like, hey, if I give African countries and like my neighboring, we can create an alliance between each other to go against the Western ideals. Unfortunately, it did fail simply because there's already a hegemony already on the basis that it's so hard to remove it.
Right. So many hegemonies and so many actors, and obviously, a worldwide situation. We can only hope in the future that as we continue to build liberal institutions similar to the UN, similar to the EU, that if this happens again sometime in the near future, that we're better equipped for it.
Yeah. And we need to have in which there's like actual institutions of enforcement rather than just like an alliance of contract. Because I feel like liberalism really falls apart in terms of the actual doing part. We can have multiple nations combining each other, but at the end of the day, it's the fact of doing that falls in liberalism.
And even then, most of the action we see isn't for the most humanitarian reasons. We often see military or economic aid acting as an IOU of sorts to other countries, and that has us moving rapidly towards like neoliberalism on an international scale, which is not, I think, the main goal of liberal institutionalism.
Definitely, yeah. Like it's gotten to the point where I think I don't know, you guys could also like come in, but I think that at the end of the day, offensive realism is what everyone's mindset, because it's the idea that like I can be more powerful and I just have the sense of security of like my people over other countries.
Yeah. I mean, it's a hard day to be an offensive realist because as much as it pains me to agree with the theory, it's just what has been occurring during this pandemic. And I don't really think it was the appropriate response or the most humanitarian or even maybe the most beneficial for all players involved. But at the end of the day, it was beneficial for the powerful states. And those are the ones who are calling the shots right now. And as much as it's tough for me to admit it, all you can do is hope and pray that next time we have a pandemic, that states will behave differently for the goodness of us all.
We forget how terrifying a pandemic can be until it hits us again. The last pandemic we had was the Spanish flu, and it lasted 2 years, I believe.
Yeah.
It never got resolved. So I'd say we've done better this time around reacting to the pandemic, getting a solution for it, because like I said, the Spanish flu disappeared after 2 years and they couldn't find a vaccine for it, the same way that we found a vaccine for COVID. But we're still having trouble in terms of states acting in cooperation with each other.
It's interesting to point out that like during the Spanish flu, there wasn't a solution, but now there is a solution, yet nobody is taking the solution, if that makes sense. Like nobody is like, oh, here's a solution for COVID and let me use it to help people and to let me use it because there's actually a decent solution. And so it's like, even though it's better, it's still worse because of the way that we use COVID vaccines.
It really feels like a 1 step forward, 2 steps back situation.
Yeah, and I think the bottom line here is that liberal institutions have, for lack of a better term, failed in providing an environment that can give the vaccine to everybody. But it really is our hope here at the COVID crew that that the things we've talked about can hopefully start providing ideas for these institutions to improve, and so that countries won't retreat to self-help models and focus on themselves. And I think that would be really beneficial, especially for just getting COVID to end.
Never mind preparing for the next pandemic. Let's just end this one as soon as we
Yes.
can.
Yep.
Now we're
So-
still in a pandemic, everyone.
With that, I think that concludes our little talk. So I'd like to thank all of our listeners, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Yep,
Join us
thanks.
for COVID Crew some other time. Maybe.
All right. See you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.
See you next time.